Isaiah chapter 34 last week. We got through the first two verses down to verse 3, but in the first four verses there is a warning to those who hate God's way. And while this is written back in Isaiah's day, it would be just as applicable to our day and time as well. But all creation is encouraged to come and hear what God has to say. And in verse 2, he mentions the fact that God's anger is against all people, all nations that oppose him and his people. In verse 3, he says, "Their slain also shall be cast out, and their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood." This is a rather disgusting picture that God presents of those who oppose him and his way. A disgusting picture of the horribleness of their judgment. He uses a symbolism of dead bodies and the blood that has decayed to the point of stinking. Many have noted through the years that the stench of a dead body, that it is sickening. Some have said it's a smell that you will never forget. So that's the depiction that God is using at this point in time. Failure to bury the dead was considered a shame and a disgrace. And sometimes it was an intentional insult. Someone read Jeremiah 22 and verse 19. Was that Jeremiah 22:19?
I got it.
Okay. That's the problem with phones. You get the numbers sometimes get so small you press the wrong number. Buried with the burial of an ass, basically just cast aside, cast forth beyond the gates of Jerusalem. Not even a proper burial made. Here, though, Isaiah is describing that there are so many that are dead and so few that are left alive that it's basically becomes impossible to bury all the dead. Well, we're going to get to that one. Young points out that the language makes clear in no uncertain terms the contemptuousness, defeat of the once arrogant nations that had arrayed themselves against the Lord and his anointed. He says, compared Joel 2:20 and Amos 4:10. God is treating them with contempt. They sicken him, disgusting to him, and he is showing the contempt that he has for them. Now, what Paul was getting to, the mountains being melted. Well, that's hyperbole. That it's used or taken from water coming down with torrents on a mountain, and it washes it away. Well, that's basically why he's saying instead of water, it's blood. That's the amount of blood that's being shed. That it would cause mountains to erode. At Normandy, when they invaded, yeah, it was waves of blood. That's what I've heard.
Maybe it's described because of the natural intermingling of so much blood with dirt. It was described that way, figuratively or hyperbole-wise.
Now, what is a hyperbole?
It's an exaggeration.
Okay, an exaggeration. Hyperboles are used on a regular basis throughout the scriptures. I guess I'll go ahead and get in trouble a little bit, but if you look at the 51st Psalm, and there has been a great deal of controversy over verse 5. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. I believe, this is my view, that it's hyperbole. That David is just saying, talking about the greatness of his sin from his birth, his conception. I know that there are about 4 different views that are prominent. Some rebel against the view that I would take because they say, oh, then you believe in total depravity. The baby is born in sin. No. I don't believe that. I believe he's using hyperbole. I don't think he's literally talking about that aspect, that he was born in sin. That's the thing. If you take one of the other views that are prominent among brethren, the other 3 views, I have trouble harmonizing that with David's purpose in writing this. David's purpose in writing this is to state, I have sinned. I am a sinner because of the sin with Bathsheba. And to me, none of the other 3 views capture that aspect of it. So I think it basically harmonizes with that. Here's another one in Psalm 58 and verse 3. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. How many of you have heard a baby speak from the womb? Be something, wouldn't it? How do we understand that then? Well, it's simple. He's using hyperbole. Well, there's one person to show the ridiculousness of that view that argued when a baby cries, he's lying. And that is a sad excuse to try and explain something, but it's the extent that they go to hang on to their false doctrine. Babies don't speak.
If such the kingdom of heaven, that means heaven is filled with corruption, according to that reason.
Well, we're not trying to. I know. I know. And yes, we've talked about that before. But here, it's using hyperbole to show that people lie. And the thing is, they go astray, according to total depravity advocates. They don't go astray, they are astray. They are astray from the time of conception. But this says they go astray. How do you go astray if you're already astray? It's hyperbole. And I think the same thing is said in Isaiah 51:5 in regards to David.
How could you go astray if you were destined to hell before the foundation of the world by God's foreknowledge?
Well,
And that's theoretical, idiotic view.
they have lots of difficulties along that line. But that's another subject. Just wanted to show the idea of hyperbole. It's used regularly throughout the Scriptures. This is a case of hyperbole, that the mountains being melted with their blood, in other words, the blood basically melting a mountain, eroding a mountain. Well, no, not literally, but using hyperbole, he's showing in figurative statements or figurative language the destruction that's coming upon them. We do, don't we? So many times we use hyperbole in so many things. Not only to show how bad something is, but sometimes show how good something is. So, how many have ever used, I made a ton of money? Have you ever tried to weigh money and try and weigh a ton of it? 2,000? Well, we're using hyperbole, of course. And we recognize that. The Bible uses these types of figures as well. Now then, mountains in the Scriptures oftentimes represent governments and rulers, the kings of the world, or a specific nation. So when he talks about this, that mountains shall be melted with their blood, a mountain basically being eroded, if the mountain is representing a government, what's it saying about that government or that people? It's crumbling. It's going to be totally wiped out.
Illustrates the fear and apprehension that's coming to a boil inside the minds of people who are saying, wow, look what's happening in our nation. What else is going to happen? People are scared to death of what's going to happen based on what already has happened, and they're apprehensive.
That is true. in making the application to our nation. But you can also look at other nations. Look at what's going on in France right now. And the riots that are taking place there. Look at the riots that have taken place in our nation. And you continue to see within our nation and other nations a crumbling of the nation, the moral fiber of a nation. Well, I will. Start not to say this because it becomes a little political. But look at our military now. They are more concerned with wokeness than they are military preparedness. Right, new recruits are just nothingness. They're weak, not what they need to be. But yet, of course, the military.
Take part in Bronco's, how are we going to have your back next to one of those two?
Well, that becomes an individual matter, and we're talking about the military as a whole. And the military as a whole has become more concerned with being politically correct and those things instead of what their very purpose, to be able to go to war. And so we see that continual crumbling of our nation and the foundations of our nation. And so it would well represent, let me change that, it would well be applicable to our nation as well, is what he's saying here. Look at Isaiah 37 and verse 36. And you see what happens to the Assyrians. Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So 185,000 killed during the night. The nation, excuse me, the nation of Assyria is basically, from a military standpoint and their might and thus everything that they are, destroyed. In verse 4 then, he adds, and all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their hosts shall fall down, as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. Again, Isaiah is still portraying the fall of nations, specifically those nations that have been opposed to him and to his people. This time, in this verse, he uses more cosmic upheavals, the heavens, the host of heavens, and so forth, that they are dissolved. Again, these figures are often used in both the Old Testament and sometimes in the New Testament for the destruction of nations. The host, okay, Dale.
Maybe you can dispose of this thought. Could this be dual applied, tied into 2 Peter 3, 10 to 12, as well as locally contextually applied simultaneously, or would that be improper?
2 Corinthians 3:10.
Tied in with 2 Peter 3:10-12 about dissolve, virgin heat and all that stuff of the heavens in the day of the Lord, having that.
Oh, Joel.
Extended application as well as contextual application right here.
Not specifically, because Isaiah is using these verses to show the destruction of Assyria in particular. But it would be any of those nations that oppose him at that point in time.
I disagree with you, but I thought he was talking about Edom.
Where? Here?
In chapter 34, I thought 34, 9-17 was about Edom, but maybe I'm wrong. I just thought it was. About Edom, southeast of Israel. Seems like it was, but I could be wrong. I remember it could be bad.
Well, we'll get to those verses before too long, but these things specifically refer to Assyria, though, and the destruction of Assyria. Can it have an application? Or application is not the right word. Can it be used as a figure of other judgments? Absolutely. I think any judgment by God upon a nation or a people in the Old Testament, for example, is a figure of eternal judgment, eternal punishment. Is it talking about that? Absolutely not. But I think it becomes a figure of it. So could it, in that sense, apply to those? Yes, from that standpoint. But it's not talking about that.
But you stated it better than I could have stated it.
Okay. The host here, host of heaven, all their host, would be basically the stars of heaven. But, again, the term host or stars of heaven, often that figure is used to represent kings and rulers. And thus, if it's representative of a king of a certain nation, the king is representative of that nation, and so it has reference to that nation as a whole, but specifically to kings. A scroll that he mentions, rolled together as a scroll. We understand, I guess, what a scroll is. Well, when it's talking about rolled together as a scroll, you take a scroll and you start rolling it up, and that is rolled up is past. It's gone, in effect. Now we know that you could unroll it and get to the location, but it's basically that which has already taken place, that which is past. So these scrolls would be, or these nations would be rolled up as a scroll, in that they're gone, they're past, they're no longer there. And we could look at a lot of the nations that Isaiah deals with, and we could ask the question, how many of them are around nowadays?
You could say that the Amalekites were rolled together as a scroll by Saul, but not in totality, because he spared Agag and several of the animals.
Well, Agag was killed, though, by Samuel. So, yes, you could use that figure for them. You could use that figure for most of the nations of that time. They just don't exist nowadays. So, because of their opposition to God, and well, I think that's what we mentioned. All of those nations, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. I mean, you keep going. Most all of the nations are gone.
What happened to the Philistines?
I mean, you keep mentioning nations. This principle is the same. But Isaiah is also basically saying the entire universe is closing in on them. Their time is short. And the end of those nations would be as a leaf falling off the vine. How leaves fall off the fig tree, or the figs falling. If you got oak trees, you know what they're talking about. Yep. Most trees, though, shed their leaves. That's the figure of these nations. They're losing their strength and they're falling apart. The great powers of that time that oppose God and His people, they're crumbling. And the land is becoming so barren that basically no one's going to be able to survive. So, a very vivid picture that Isaiah portrays to us of the utter destruction of these nations, that they are putrid, they stink because of their opposition to God. We were talking about this just a moment ago, but Homer Haley has this quote about this section that although the picture portrayed in these two verses may foreshadow the end of the world, the prophet does not have this in mind. Rather, he is describing in strong metaphor the end of the world for the heathen nations. When God's wrath and indignation comes against the nations that oppose and fight against Him, their world comes to an end. You see that in history over and over and over and over again. I can remember when I was growing up, that was just a couple of decades ago, and I can remember preachers using the statement, and I believe it was stated or written by Toynbee, that at that time, of the nations that had reached the moral standard of the United States, 18 out of 21 of them had already been destroyed. And he was talking about from world history. The standard of morality at that time, while it was, I grew up in the 60s, and we did have a great moral collapse during that period of time. It is nothing in comparison to what we see today. And I keep thinking, I hadn't studied history of nations like they had, or he had, in making that statement. But if that was the case back then, in the 60s and 70s, early 70s, I don't know exactly when he made the statement, but if that was the case back then I can imagine you could almost say 20 out of 21 today. I find it difficult to imagine any nation that has reached the moral degradation of the United States still existing. And that goes back to the moral standard that we need to go by. As long as we reject God's standard, morals will continue to get worse. And the problem with our society today, the reason that we are in such condition today, is because years ago we rejected God out of all teaching and out of our society to as much as possible. And thus, now then, well, I'll go ahead and say it, that anyone who sends their children to schools of higher education are sending them to the wolves to be destroyed. Because our institutes of moral or higher education is where all of this immorality and ungodliness and stupidity is originating. And then they go out and disseminate it among others. And those are the individuals who become the teachers of the next generation. And then you start seeing from the colleges and universities those same principles being executed and infiltrated into our high schools and into our elementary schools. And now then you start seeing what we see in our society. But all because we rejected God years ago. Any comments?
Got a payday coming.
Well, there is going to be a payday coming. Mm-hmm. They were totally ostracized because of they were shacking up. Now then, that is expected. Well, I'll just add to it from this standpoint. Way back in the 60s, when we first started seeing this, the leaders of that were rebelling, and they were causing riots and things like that. That didn't work. So what they learned to do was to forget about that and get into the universities and the colleges. Now, that it's taken a long time to get to where we are now, but that's what started happening way back then. Before that, you didn't see that taking place. What you saw, those who tried to change society like into what we're seeing today, is they used riots and fighting and so forth. And it did not work. It was not successful. This has been successful. Guess how we can stop it, or how we will be able to stop it? Gotta get God back in there. And that means at the highest levels of education. And just as their immorality filtered down, the morality has to be set there, and it will filter down. And then we start teaching on an individual basis and allowing it to filter up. Because he was divorced. And now then it doesn't make any difference. But you're right, Ronald Reagan could not run for president at first because he was a divorced man. It is interesting how things change along that line. And what it makes me think of is the Mormons. If you remember history, Mormons, that was polygamy. That's the way in which a lot of it started. Joseph Smith was a pervert, and he got this vision from God that you should be able to, he can marry someone else. And he even told his wife, I think her name was Emma, that if she didn't like it, she's to keep her mouth shut. Not even to object to him marrying someone else. This was supposedly in revelation from God. And of course, in order for Utah then to become a state, because the United States rejected polygamy, they had to all of a sudden get this new revelation from God that polygamy was wrong. It was one of the great attacks against the home and the family. Now then, look at the ads that they placed on television and how family-oriented it supposedly is and all of this. When in reality, their organization was one of the greatest attacks against the home that you could find. And I think it's interesting if you look at their documents how that polygamy was going to be an unchangeable law that they happened to change so that they could become a state. I see you didn't. Verses 5 through 7. And this is where Edom comes into play, actually, Dale. God's sword used to judge Edom in verses 5 through 7. And we'll start, won't get through with verse 5, but he says, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment." So now then he is directing his attention to one who hates God's ways, and that's Edom. Edom is called here Idumea. It's called that a few other times, I think, but it is, we basically or better know it as Edom. Now, who were the Edomites?
Esau's descendants.
Okay, the descendants of Esau. Who was Esau?
Jacob's brother through I forget, Isaac and that name.
Okay. They were descendants of Esau, who was Isaac's brother, but God chose Isaac as to that one to whom the seed would come through, and not Esau.
So Jacob actually.
Okay. They were a perpetual antagonist to Israel. And if we read Ezekiel, the 35th chapter, we would see that. They were constantly, throughout their history, at war with the Israelites. They hated the Israelites because the Israelites were God's chosen people and they were not. So, as a result, they hated the Israelites. The sword would include anything from a sword of war to a knife or any other cutting instrument. Here, it might reference a knife that was used in sacrificing animals to God. Thus, the figure is God is appearing as one who is about to sacrifice Edom. And they are simply victims for the slaughter. They're about to be slaughtered by God. So, my sword, God says, my knife to slay them, to sacrifice them, is bathed in heaven, shall be bathed in heaven. Not a pretty picture for the Edomites to start out with. And because we've only got less than a minute, I'll stop at that point, but and we'll start with the idea of bathed next time, Lord willing.